sent a reminder, as he does for when I'm singing. He always reminds me, and I appreciate that so much. He said, also, you're teaching a class, what's your title? And I thought, well, I haven't thought of a title yet. So I have David. Goliath isn't always the challenge, but after that I thought of a couple of other titles that would match well. Giants aren't always the biggest things that our young folks face. And then when I really got to thinking about it, here's what I need you to think about. Am I the one keeping people from defeating the giants in their lives? Now, I want you to think about poor... Uh-oh. I always do this. Well, it's not wanting to go. Maybe I'll have someone technical that'll come help me. But, see, here he comes. But I want to keep going. So, I want to ask you another question. When was Goliath defeated? At what point in this story of David and Goliath was Goliath defeated? When did that happen? There we go. See, I want you to think about this. David didn't just overcome Goliath. David overcame his family, he overcame the crowd, and he overcame a king. Think about that. There's more to the story than just David and Goliath. See, all those other obstacles had to be overcome, and then David defeated Goliath. Now I'm going to ask you another question. See, 3 questions. I'll expect there'll be a quiz at the end. I have you expect your answers. There will be grading. I will not grade on a curve, so good luck. What do you think was easiest? What do you think was easiest for David to do? Do you think it was easiest for David to overcome his family? Now, some of you might be saying, well, what do you mean by that, Russell? I'm not sure what you're talking about. Well, let's look at it. Let's start back all the way back in 1 Samuel 16. Now, here we have Samuel is pouting. Well, I shouldn't use the word pouting, but he's not happy. How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing as I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, and I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. Samuel shows up. He tells Jesse, I'm going to be sacrificing. Bring all your sons together. Jesse does that. He says, here they are. Because now Jesse had asked him, he'd asked Samuel, he said, are you coming peacefully? And Samuel said, yes. I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourself and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. And it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Samuel is apparently not a very good judge of character, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Fortunately, the Lord is. He sees Eliab, he thinks this has got to be the guy, and sure enough, it's not. As the story continues, as the history continues, Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, the Lord hath not chosen these. And Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And Jesse said, well, there remaineth yet the youngest. And behold, he keepeth the sheep. Now, I don't want to read too much into that. And I don't tend to like to do that. I tend to try to let the Scriptures speak for themselves without reading a whole lot between the lines. But man, that's pretty rough. Everyone else of my brothers has come to this feast. Everyone else has come to see the famous Samuel sacrifice at my family. And I'm out keeping the sheep? You're telling me that Jesse doesn't have servants? He doesn't have somebody else that can just cover this job this one time? But apparently not. As this story continues, David is anointed. And at this point, the Lord comes to David. I'm sorry, it doesn't come to him, but the Spirit of the Lord moves on David. And Saul becomes more unhinged. He becomes more problematic. And then there's an evil spirit that comes on Saul and leaves him totally just out of it. And one of his servants says, I know of a guy that has a son that can play on the harp. And they even call him a great man of war, that he's a really great kid. And they bring him to play for Saul. And David's harp playing soothes this horrible spirit that comes on Saul. And Saul calls to Jesse. He says, and Saul sent to Jesse. Now this is important. Saul doesn't go to Jesse, he sent to him. In other words, he sent a messenger. This will come into play a little later on. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took a harp and played with his hands. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. Not only is David now in the presence of the king of Israel. Now just imagine if one of your children, you get a call from the king of England. I don't know, the king of Belgium. They've still got a king, I think, one of those places. Or the president. I mean, I don't care what your politics are, what side of the line you fall on. But if your son is there working for the president of the United States calls you up and says, hey, I really like your son. He's doing a great job for me. How proud would you be? How many people would you tell? Quite a few, I'm sure. Jesse, apparently not so much. David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now, this is in chapter 17. The battle's begun. The Philistines are there. Now, I don't know what the deal is. There's 7 other brothers. 3 of them are fighting on the front lines. David is looking after the sheep. I don't know where the other brothers are. We're not told. We have no details about them. We know nothing. But I think if my son I'd been told by the king that your son has found favor, I might not send him out to the sheep pasture anymore. But Jesse did. I don't know. Maybe it kept David's head out of the clouds. Can't say. But Eliab, that eldest brother, tells me something about the dynamics of this family, and it's not good. Now, David is back taking after the sheep. His 3 brothers, oldest brothers, and his oldest brother Eliab, they're on the front lines. They're fighting the Philistines. Goliath shows up, and for 40 days, Goliath challenges the men, quote unquote, the men of Israel. Now, as this is going on, Jesse begins to worry after his sons. He wants some information, and he sends not one of his other sons, but he sends David. And he says, David, I want you to take this food, give it to our brothers, just like a little care package. I want you to take this other food, give it to the army, get an idea of what's going on, and come back and tell me. David shows up. He happens to show up at the point that Goliath is standing up, making his challenge. He sees all of the people of Israel, all of the men of war of Israel, cowering in fear. And he is outraged. And he says, who is this man that challenges the people of God? Who is this? Why doesn't someone go deal with this Philistine? And his brother Eliab is there and says, David, you're right. One of us should go out there and fight that Goliath. Let's go. We can take him together. No, that is not what happens. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard what he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why comest thou down hither? Point 1. Accusation 1. And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. Now, that naughtiness of heart means insolence, evil. his eldest brother, has judged David and found him lacking. He accuses David. His motivations are questioned. He is suspected of failure in his duties to the sheep. He is accused of being prideful and haughty, insolent, evil-hearted. You're just making these accusations. You're just talking the way you're talking to rile someone up so you can watch the fight. I know what's in your heart, David. I know what kind of man I know what kind of boy you are. Incidentally, just as an aside, it's not that important, I don't think. But if you take a little time to do the math and to kind of figure on a little sheet on the back of an envelope, David could have been as young as 16 here. Probably not much younger. He could have been as old as up into his 20s, possibly 25, but not much older than that. If he was in his 30s, he'd have been on the front lines. That's just the way it was. But he was probably between 16 and 25. Didn't used to be all that young to me, but now it is pretty young. I know some of you are a little bit older than me, looking at me going, you're still a pretty young whippersnapper. No. But he was probably about 16, maybe 25, somewhere in there. He's still a young man. And this is what he got from his brother. David he's questioned. He's accused. Now I want to point this out to you. Back in 1 Samuel 17:20, David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper. He didn't leave those sheep abandoned. He took responsibility. He took care of his sheep because they were whose sheep? They were his. And took and went as Jesse had commanded him. He wasn't going on his own idea. He didn't go on a lark or because he wanted to go, although he probably did want to go. I'm not going to say he didn't. But he didn't abandon his duties to do this. He did this at Jesse's command. And he came to the trench as the host was being brought forth for battle. Each accusation made against David in that circumstance by his older brother was unwarranted and unfair. Eliab didn't even ask him why he was there. He didn't even express or ask, how's our father doing? How are things back home? Oh, it's great to see you, David. I've missed you so much. I can't imagine you brought these things. Oh, thank you, David. He didn't do any of that. Poor David. Actually, in all honesty, when I read this right here, this is what brought this whole lesson to me. And David says, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had a boss. I had the great misfortune of having one of those that you can do nothing right. I had a boss when I worked at Walmart. She was out to get me. I don't know why to this day. I don't have a clue why she wanted to get me, but she did. Maybe it was something I said. Maybe it was something I did. Maybe she didn't like the cut of my jib. I'm not sure. Never found out, never asked. I could do nothing right. I could do what she asked me to do, and I still got tagged for it. At night, if you got to be familiar with this, we would have to straighten up the store. Well, the people that stocked would come back in and push everything back. So, I mean, it was a waste of time, but whatever. I did it. I'd get tagged the next morning. I got tired of it, and I asked myself this question: what have I done now? This is not the question of a young man that's supported. This is not the question of a young man that has had good relations with his brothers, possibly even his father. This is not the first time that Eliab is torn into David. Now, again, as I said, I try not to read between the lines, but man, can you not read between the lines on this statement? What have I done now? Can I even ask a question? Can I even make a statement? Is not what I'm saying fair? Do I not have reason to say what it is I'm saying? Do I not have reason to ask why this Goliath hasn't been dealt with? What have I done now? Incidentally, with that supervisor that was trying to get me, she got me twice, and I said, that ain't going to happen the third time. And I kept detailed notes as to what I was doing on a 15-minute rotation of everything I'd done. I took pictures. That's back when you started having phones where you could take pictures. Christy made me get one. They weren't very nice pictures, but they were pictures. And the night manager, I had him sign off on the sheet that I had done because I'd made her write everything down. And I got pulled into the office by the big boy, my big head honcho, and he said, why didn't this all this out? Well, I said, sir, but it did. And I held it all out and I showed him. I didn't have any more problems after that. But David, poor David, what have I done now? Do you see what I'm saying here? A lot of people are going to would have been dismayed by this. Can you not see how a young man would be dismayed by this accusation by his eldest brother, someone that should love him, should cherish him, should hold him up, should support him? In Jewish society, the eldest brother was important. He had an important position. He had an important position of authority. He was going to be the person that would look after the household after the father died. This is not... He should have been something more to David. And the thing is that Eliab's anger, why do you think Eliab was so angry? Again, see, with this lesson, I'm doing something that I try not to do. But there's so much to read between the lines here. Why do you think Eliab was so angry at David? There are few things in this world that make us more angry than for someone to tell us what we're doing wrong. Especially when they are right. There's a couple of times I've had to kind of go, I've had my own words sent back to me by my children. And I'm like, Eliab knew that David's accusation, that what David was saying was true. He knew that they should have risen up. He knew that they should have gone to the field with Goliath. Do or die. 40 days. They've stood there. Crowd. You think it was easiest for David to overcome the crowd? Think that was an easy thing for him to do? We talk about things like peer pressure, right? And we pretend like that's only for kids. What about that guy at work that tells the dirty jokes? What about those people that have gotten away with sexual harassment and other criminal, problematic behaviors, and they've gotten away with it for years because people have allowed them to? Well, we have a crowd. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines called Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now that would be, give or take, anywhere from 8 feet 5 inches all the way up to maybe 9 feet 2 inches. Now I am 6'2", a little less than that now. Gravity has taken a toll. So I am not used to looking up at people. So John over there, it's always disconcerting to me to talk to John for a few minutes because I have to adjust to looking up at people. There was a kid at school one year and he was 6'4". He was a 7th grader. And that kid was big, and it threw me every time I saw him. I'm not used to looking up to people, although it happens to me. Christy at work, her main employee at Patterson, he's what, 6'6", is it, Christy? Christy's like, yeah, he's tall. And I'm like, hello, how are you, sir? So imagine this man, he's 8 feet. I don't doubt that they were dismayed. I don't doubt that they were frightened. Who wouldn't be? Now imagine some of these basketball players that we have that are 6'6", 6'7", 6'8". You watch them, you watch their physicality. You watch how fast and strong they are on the courts. Goliath wasn't some small moving giant who was just kind of bumbling around on the battlefield. He was a man of war. And he was terrifying. Not discounting any of that. The Bible goes through details of explaining everything about what he looked like and all this stuff, but I want to look at the very last part, verse 11. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. That was the crowd that David saw as he comes up. That was the crowd that David was in. They were afraid and dismayed. And when all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him. Now I want you to look at something. Verse 26. And David spake to the man that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And they listed this whole big thing of all this reward that someone is going to get, these financial reward that everybody's going to get that could defeat this. And I want you to notice a contrast between David and this crowd. The crowd is frightened. David is outraged. The crowd is fixated on the financial rewards. But David is concerned about the reproach to God's people. The crowd is ready to continue to play it safe and do nothing and just sit and hide down behind their trench there and just talk about, oh, if only somebody would do something. Oh, if only somebody would do something. You want to know one of the strongest things I learned as a father about getting stuff done at home? I'll give this advice to any young parents in here right now. If you want something done at the house, or actually, this probably works for anywhere else for that matter, and you say, I need somebody to do the dishes, guess what happens? Now, see, I can tell some of you are like, oh, I know exactly what happens, and some of you are like, no, what happens? I don't. It doesn't get done. You want it done. Oh, she's like, no, you're right. If you want it done, what you have to say is Jeremiah, you do the dishes. Lily, you do this. Tempest, you do this. Christy, you do... Well, no, I don't. No. But you all know this crowd, don't you? They know what needs to be done. They know what the right thing to do. They know, but they don't want to do it. They're afraid, they're dismayed, and they're looking to each other. They're looking for that courage. They're looking for somebody, anybody to lead them. Someone to show them the way. Someone needs to do something. Somebody ought to do something. Every time I've heard people say that, and I'll think in the back of my head, well, you go do something then if you think it's that important. Have at it. That's the crowd that David saw. Here was a crowd that stood in inaction, fear. And they were concerned more about the earthly things than they were the things of God. And this is who David found himself amongst. And then this crowd did, when they had one guy that spoke up, when they had one guy that spoke the truth, when they had one guy that said, well, here's what we ought to do, here's what we could do, why don't we do this, why don't we... What did they do? They tattled on him to the king. They told the boss. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them. I always like how the King James says that, rehearsed them. They rehearsed them. They retold what David had said. Now, I've read between the lines so many times in this lesson, Alan, I'm just going to quit saying I don't do this very often. Do you think they really told the full story about what David said and how he said it? My experience with that kind of thing is no, it usually doesn't work out that way. And that Saul, sent for him. Now, we have a king. Let me ask you this. Do you think it was easiest for David to overcome this king? Think that was the easiest thing he did? And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, being Goliath. Thy servant will go. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. For thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. See, the king discouraged. Now you could say, well, he was looking out for David. He knew David. He knew David was this kid that was playing the harp for him. He was looking out for him. He was looking out for David's best interest. He was concerned for David. Now I'm going to point something out to you. Later on, I don't have this in here, but it's something that the more I've thought about it, the more I've come to it. We give Saul I've heard preachers give Saul way more credit than he deserves here. Because Saul was so concerned about David, he was so interested in David, he was so wanting to help David out that he didn't even have a clue who David's father was. Now there have been some commentators and other people that attack the Bible that say, well, see, there's a disconnect here. But what they're missing is this. How many of you all have worked for a boss? I had this misfortune too. That they don't know who you are. I mean, they kind of recognize you, but they know nothing about you. And like I'm not saying a boss needs to be your buddy, but at some point they do need to show a little bit of human concern. Have a little bit of, I saw a boss one time, and this poor lady, she just got back from grief. I mean, her husband had died. And he said, and I kid you not, I'm glad you're back. You really put me in a bind while you were gone. And I thought, dude, her husband had died. It's not like she purposely set out to put you at, I'm sorry that disconvenienced you. See, that's where Saul is. The Bible actually says that he loved David, but I think he did. He loved David because he could give him relief. He loved David because he could play the harp. He loved David because he could do something for him. He didn't even know who David was. He didn't know who his father was. He had to ask. This king discouraged. And then, as this goes on, David says to Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and I took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. When he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. This is hardcore, folks. And this is David, taking care of his little flock out in the wilderness. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. And notice where David is putting his faith here. Where does David put his faith? David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hands of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. Now, again, that sounds like, Saul is encouraging him, wishing him luck. But here's the problem. The king has just shirked his duty. He sent a 16 to 25-year-old young man, who he just got through saying, you're not going to be able to take this guy. He's sending him to do the battle that Saul himself should have already done. The individual that should have met Goliath on that battlefield, do or die, should have been Saul. Because that's what the expectation of a king was during that period of time. You didn't have generals fighting their battles back in their safe spots, back on the back lines there. Not during this time. The kings were on the front lines, fighting with their men. And Saul was the tallest. If you'll remember, Saul was a tall fellow for his time. Now, he probably wasn't 8 to 9 feet tall, but he was tall. It should have been Saul. And it's not like Saul was an old man. Now later on we'll see where Saul does go to battle, trying to kill David. So he was still capable, he just didn't do it here. You know why? Do you know why he didn't do it? Because he listened to that crowd. He listened to the people. See, that was the biggest thing that Saul, if you were to really say what was Saul's fatal flaw. See, in a lot of Greek mythology, now I'm not comparing this to Greek mythology, but there is some connection here. In Greek mythology, the heroes, they always have some sort of fatal flaw. What do we say? Achilles' heel, right? Because Achilles could be killed. The anger of Hercules. I mean, all of these flaws that they had. Well, if you were to give Saul a flaw, his flaw was he listened to the crowd. He let the crowd direct him. You mentioned it the other night. What did he do? Oh, the people. It was the people. I thought I was doing it for them. When he didn't wipe out the entire city, it was the people. Like Samuel says, what's this lowing of sheep that I hear, Saul? It was the people. They made me do it. Saul should have been out there. That's where Saul should have been. That was his job. That was the expectation. That was his duty to do that. But he didn't. He sent David. Then he went further. 1 Samuel 17. And Saul armed David with his armor. And he put a helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor. And he essayed to go. That means he tried to move. He tried to move in this stuff. For he had not proved it. And then David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. David put them off him. Now, you ever seen armor, brass and armor of these things, archaeologists and others? Have you ever seen like knights' armor, medieval knights' armor? Now there was a tournament armor that they wore that was just ridiculous, and they actually had to be hoisted onto a horse and all this stuff. Not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the true battle armor that they wore. I saw a great show, they were talking about it, and they had a guy that was in the knight's armor. You know what he could do? He could do a handstand. He did a whirly whirl. He got up, jumped up and down, climbed a wall, anywhere from 50 to about 70, 80 pounds, which incidentally is what our soldiers often carry into battle with all their equipment and other things like that. So this armor, you're looking at 70, 80 pounds. This would have been high quality armor. You know how I know it was high quality armor? It's the king's. It's the king's armor. You don't give the king bad armor. You give him the best. This is good stuff. Wasn't a thing wrong with this armor. Except it shifted, or would have shifted, David's trust. And more importantly, you get that little sign where it says he essayed to go. He attempted to go. He attempted to move in it. He would have been moving slow in this armor because, interesting thing about armor like this, and here again, I'm reading some stuff in, but this is just archaeology tells us this is how it is, and if we think about it, we know this is how it is. When you make armor like this for a king, he doesn't just go grab it off the rack. This armor is specifically made, tailored to fit the body. This is how armor like that was made forever. Now you have your peasant people, your militias, and they wore whatever they had. But this armor had been specifically built, specifically smithed for Saul. And what do we know about Saul? He was tall. This armor did not fit David. It slowed him down. But the most important part is it shifted what he was placing trust in. Who he was trusting. This king gave really bad advice. I mean, I can't overstate how bad this advice was. I mean, it was really, 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 really terrible advice. Did I mention how bad the advice was? I do this to drive this point home. David had taken off the armor of God. His faith, his trust in God to deliver him. If David had taken that armor off and put on Saul's armor, putting his trust in a man and a failed king who did not follow God's will, if he had shifted that, if he had taken off the armor that had delivered him from the bear, if he had taken off the armor that had delivered him from the lion, if he put on King Saul armor and put his trust in a man, in Saul, in a failed king, Goliath would have killed him. I don't have to guess at that. I don't have to wonder. I know it as a fact. David would have died. Goliath would have come out there. He'd have taken that spear, and David would have been clumping around in that armor. He couldn't have moved. He'd have been trying to get his sling to go. He'd have tried to pull the sword out. And Goliath, well, if you did the math on this, let's see, where are you, Alan? Yeah. Shunk. There you go. David wouldn't even been there. That spear would have gone right through. And then the story of David and Goliath would be about how a giant defeated the little guy. I can't emphasize this enough. The advice that Saul gave David would have gotten him killed. Now, as I read through this, I reread the story, it hit me. In my opinion, what did Saul ultimately do? Oh, I didn't get that large. I'm sorry, guys. That's 1 Samuel 18. I've skipped forward a little bit. Now, what did, after David defeated Goliath, saved the children of Israel, saved the people of God, saved them, gave them victory, what did Saul do? David returned. I'll skip down, and verse 9, and Saul eyed David from that day forward. The people were celebrating David's victory, and rightfully so. Saul didn't like it. He eyed him. He was envious. Then a little later on in Samuel 18, verse 14, and David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. Now let me ask you a question. If you're envious of somebody, if you're afraid of them, well, what's the next logical step? How do we come to that? 1 Samuel 19. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son. Now if you're here for when they're talking about Jonathan, you'll know why this was a bad mistake, but I won't, spoilers ahead, so I won't spoil it. And to all his servants, that they should kill David. We're talking some real Game of Thrones stuff here, Game of Swords level intrigue here, Machiavellian stuff. Saul's seeking to kill him. Saul envied David, Saul feared David, Saul attempted to kill David, and all David had done was played a harp to soothe Saul and save the nation. Yeah, he deserved that. Now, after all this, David defeated Goliath. And honestly, I'll tell you, when I reread it, it was almost, the defeat of Goliath was almost anticlimactic to me. At this point, what's David do? He gets there, he goes, he gets the stones, he gets 5 of them, and if you want to go down a rabbit hole sometimes, read about why people think David got 4 more stones. I mean, there are stories. There actually were 4 more giants that fought for the Philistines, so I kind of think that, I like that part of it, but we're not going to go into all that. He gets the stones, he puts them in, and I love this part. He ran at the army. He ran at the Philistines. He didn't hang back. In my mind's eye, I can see Goliath being caught ever so slightly off guard by this kid running at him. And he's slinging this thing. Now, this isn't one of these little things like this. It's a strap. It has a thing. This thing was actually used militarily, by the way, this kind of sling. This isn't a child's toy. Alexander the Great had a troop of these, sling throwers they called them. There was actually a group of mercenaries who were infamous and known for being sling throwers in the ancient world. If you hit somebody in the forehead with one of the things, you're going to deliver a lethal wound. They're going to die. Now, at the distance and everything else, David hits Goliath right in the forehead. Goliath falls, well, like a tree. And then David takes his sword and cuts his head off. That's it. It's almost anticlimactic. Again, is that the easiest thing that David did? When was Goliath defeated? When do you think Goliath was defeated? Now, I asked my mom this question. I always try this stuff out on her. And she said, well, when David hit him with a stone, and then she stopped, she said, well, I know you. There's a trick to this. There's a trick to this. Well, possibly. Could be. Could be. Oh, there we go. So when was Goliath defeated? I'm going to tell you, here's what I think. Do you know what I think when Goliath was defeated? Goliath was defeated the moment that David overcame his family, overcame his brother, and didn't listen to his brother. He was defeated the moment that David didn't listen to the crowd, and he was defeated the moment David said, I will not wear your armor, Saul, because it's not been proved. I will trust in the armor of God. That's the armor I'll use to defeat this giant. It was at that moment that Goliath's fate was sealed. There was never any doubt. Now let's ask another important question. We've got all these little kids, we've got 7th and 8th graders, we've got the kindergartner groups. How are we doing with the Davids amongst us? Now, how are we doing? Are we like David's family? Are we like David's family? Or are we making these young Christians feel loved and valued? Are we like the crowd? Or are we encouraging and pointing towards the things of God? Are we like the king? Giving really bad advice that's going to get young Christians killed on the spiritual battlefield. Holding them back, envying them, questioning their motives. I don't know about this generation today, them Generation Zers. See, a lot of people worry about woke stuff. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm not saying don't discount it. I'm not saying that at all. But you understand that they make up a really small portion of that generation, right? Do you know who some people have compared Generation Z to? Who they've said they're actually more like? They're more like the generation that overcame right after the Great Depression. Because think about what they've gone through. Gone through a major economic downturn and an epidemic that shut our country down and the world for 2 years. This is not a soft generation by any stretch of the imagination. But are we like that king? Or do we give righteous advice and seek to help and not hurt? Now, this eldership here has always looked to its youth. Do you want to know why I'm standing here right now preaching? Do you know why? Because all those years ago, there was a little class they had. What was that class called? Young men's leadership, something or other. There it was. That was my first sermon. I had a little sheet that I was given right there. Here you go, Russell. I'll never forget. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you tell them. Then tell them what you told them. And then sit down and shut up. I've tried to follow that advice with every other sermon I've ever done in the rest of my life. Oh, looky there. That, brothers and sisters, is my last slide. 7:55 on the dot. Now, Lesson's yours. Ask yourself, who are you in this story, and who do you want to be? Look to these kids. They've got giants in their lives. Don't you be the thing that keeps them from getting it and overcoming it. Hey guys, thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.